Why did the USSR never send its newest tank, the T-44, to the front? In the summer of 1943, Soviet tank crews faced a nightmare scenario. Their shells bounced off the armor of German Tigers like pebbles off a boulder, while a single shot from an 88mm gun turned a T-34 into a burning wreck. Crews were being wiped out, unable to even get within effective firing range. The Red Army Command demanded an immediate solution from its engineers. And so, at the Stalin Ural Tank Factory, number 183 in Nizhny Tagil, where the Kharkiv Tank Design Bureau had been evacuated after Operation Barbarossa, work began on a machine that was supposed to change everything. This tank was designated the T-44, and it was meant to become the killer of Germany's big cats. But not a single one of these tanks ever fired a shot in combat, even though the vehicle was ready before the war ended. The project was assigned to Alexander Morozov, the chief designer who had continued the development of the T-34 after its original creator, Mikhail Koshkin, died in 1940. Morozov understood all the shortcomings of his own design perfectly well and knew that simple upgrades wouldn't solve the problem. What was needed was a fundamentally new approach, revolutionary engineering solutions that could take Soviet tank design to an entirely different level. The designer assembled a team of top specialists and gave them an ambitious goal: build a tank with twice the armor of the T-34 without adding any extra weight. On paper, that sounded impossible. The laws of physics are unforgiving. Thicker armor inevitably means more weight. But Morozov found an ingenious solution. He completely redesigned the tank's layout, mounting the engine not lengthwise along the hull, as was standard practice, but sideways across it. This transverse engine layout allowed the team to significantly shorten the engine and transmission compartment, and use that saved space to beef up the armor. The front hull armor of the new tank reached 90mm, heavily sloped at 60 degrees, while the turret front was a formidable 120mm, enough to shrug off most German anti-tank rounds at medium and long range. Another major innovation was ditching the famous Christie suspension, which had been used on all Soviet medium tanks going back to the BT series. Morozov replaced it with torsion bar suspension, which eliminated the bulky springs from the fighting compartment and freed up extra space for the crew and ammunition storage. Now tankers could work in more comfortable conditions, and that directly affected the combat vehicle's effectiveness in battle. The heart of the new tank was the V-44 diesel engine, producing 520 horsepower. This engine was specifically designed for the new vehicle and was more reliable and more powerful than anything that came before it. Paired with a new 5-speed gearbox, it gave the tank excellent acceleration and maneuverability. During testing, the T-44 reached about 33 miles an hour on paved roads, which was impressive for something that heavily armored. As its main armament, the designers installed the 85mm ZIS S-53 gun, model 1944. This was the same weapon fitted to the upgraded T-34-85, and it had already proven itself well in combat. The gun could knock out medium German tanks at all realistic engagement distances, and with a well-placed shot, it could handle heavy enemy armor too. The ammunition load was 58 rounds, significantly more than the T-34 carried. On the outside, the T-44 kept the recognizable lines of its predecessor, but a closer look made it clear this was a completely different machine. A lower profile made the tank a harder target to spot on the battlefield. A cast turret with a streamlined shape gave incoming enemy shells a high chance of ricocheting off. The hull was easier to manufacture, and the number of weld seams was significantly reduced, which improved the overall structural strength. On November 23, 1944, the State Defense Committee issued an order accepting the T-44 into service with the Red Army. Factory number 75 in the recently liberated city of Kharkiv was designated as the manufacturer. It seemed like these cutting-edge war machines would soon head to the front to smash German armor. But Kharkiv's factory number 75 was a grim sight. The city had been liberated from occupation not long before, and the factory lay in ruins after the German retreat. Workshops were destroyed, equipment was partly hauled away, partly wrecked, and skilled workers were scattered across the country. Under these conditions, the factory was expected to start producing a new, untested tank design. The task seemed nearly impossible, but orders were orders, and the work got underway. By the end of 1944, the workers managed to assemble the first 25 T-44 tanks. It was a remarkable achievement, given the state of the production facilities and the shortage of just about everything, though still far short of the original plan to produce 300 tanks per month. But the celebration didn't last long. On December 7th, Deputy Commander of Armored and Mechanized Forces, Colonel General of Tank Forces Morozov, sent a troubling report to the People's Commissar of the tank industry, Malyshev, painting a grim picture of the quality of the first machines. The general reported that the tanks coming off the line had a whole range of serious defects, caused by errors in the blueprints and numerous deviations from the technical specifications during the production of parts and components. Morozov warned that these defects would inevitably affect the performance and combat capabilities of the machines, and would also severely complicate their field maintenance due to the lack of interchangeability between parts. Essentially, every tank was a one-off, whose parts didn't fit any other vehicle in the lot. Morozov listed the causes of this dismal situation, pulling no punches. The factory lacked the necessary equipment and didn't have the fixtures and tooling needed for precision manufacturing. There were no measuring instruments, making quality control of critical parts simply impossible. Military inspectors couldn't do their jobs properly because they literally had nothing to verify parts against the blueprints with. The general made a special note about problems with the armor supplied by the Mariupol plant. Factory number 264. The armor plates for hulls and turrets showed serious deviations from the blueprints. The height of the plates varied from tank to tank, with warping and bending of the metal. The tank's floor was supposed to consist of 3 plates, according to the drawings, but in reality it was assembled from 10, creating additional weld seams and weakening the structure. The thickness and dimensions of the turrets also deviated significantly from the design values. Morozov's verdict was harsh but fair. He ordered that the T-44 tanks from the November production run be accepted only as training vehicles, unfit for deployment to the front. At the same time, the general instructed the military representatives at factory number 75 to stop accepting tanks that deviated from the blueprints. Production was effectively blocked, because at that point the factory was simply unable to build machines without deviations. December and January of 1945 brought no improvement. The factory managed to deliver 20 tanks each month, but the quality was still nowhere near acceptable. All these machines were also accepted only as training vehicles, and sending them to the front was out of the question. At the front lines, fierce fighting was raging during the Vistula Oder offensive. The Red Army was rapidly approaching the borders of Germany, while the newest tanks, capable of going toe-to-toe with enemy vehicles, sat idle in the rear, stamped as defective. In March, the situation reached a critical point. On the 3rd of the month, the factory director issued an order that exposed the real reasons behind the failure. He identified the main problem as a lack of proper accountability among managers and department and workshop heads. Supervisors tolerated sloppy, improvised work practices and did nothing to fight resistance to implementing proper mass production techniques. High-performance machine tools that could have significantly improved the quality of parts processing sat idle in workshop number 120, while shafts were still being machined on outdated general-purpose equipment. The director noted with frustration that workshop heads didn't even know the real capabilities of the machinery they had. Workshops lacked proper storage rooms for unfinished parts, leading to uncontrolled distribution of blanks and making it possible to hide defective work. Parts went missing in huge quantities, and it was impossible to track down who was responsible. Workers weren't meeting their production quotas due to countless unrecorded downtimes, poor tool supplies, and low work discipline. The People's Commissar of the tank industry, Vyacheslav Malyshev, wasn't the kind of man to tolerate half measures. After receiving yet another set of grim reports from Kharkiv, he realized that Factory Number 75 couldn't fix its problems on its own. In March 1945, on his personal orders, a team of senior officials from the commissariat was sent to the plant. These were highly experienced specialists who had survived the brutal school of wartime factory evacuations and knew how to set up production under the most difficult conditions. Their mission was to get things in order as fast as possible and bring the quality of the new tanks up to an acceptable level. The commissariat representatives got to work with military efficiency. First, they conducted a thorough audit of the entire production process, identifying bottlenecks and sources of defects at every stage. What they found wasn't pretty. Process sheets existed only on paper. In practice, workers did things however they saw fit. Quality control was a formality because inspectors simply didn't have enough measuring instruments and reference samples to compare against. A Special Operations Bureau was established under the factory's Technical Control Department, tasked with studying the experience of already produced machines in the field. Bureau specialists collected data on every breakdown and malfunction, analyzed the causes, and developed recommendations for fixes. This work helped identify systemic problems that repeated from tank to tank, allowing targeted efforts to address them. At the same time, a permanent accident investigation commission was set up under the chief engineer. Its job was to investigate all breakdowns and failures, identify those responsible, and develop measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. The commission worked in close coordination with the design department and military inspectors, which allowed them to quickly make necessary changes to documentation and production processes. The sheer number of blueprint changes was staggering. Between January and May 1945, over 3,000 changes were made to the T-44 blueprints. Design revisions were usually initiated by the workshops themselves and were most often driven by manufacturing considerations or obvious errors in the drawings. Improvements aimed at enhancing the vehicle's combat capabilities were carried out at the request of military inspectors, based on test data from the factory and field units, as well as on the initiative of the design department. At the same time, intensive work continued on fine-tuning the manufacturing processes. The commissariat specialists pushed to ensure every operation was performed strictly according to the process sheet, with no deviations or improvisation. New inspection methods were introduced to catch defects at early stages, when fixing them didn't yet require significant time and resources. Gradually, the idle high-performance machine tools were brought online, and staff were trained to use them. Special attention was paid to coordinating with component suppliers. The Mariupol factory, number 264, which manufactured armored hulls and turrets, received clear requirements for tolerances and product quality. Additional inspectors were sent to the plant, checking every item before it was shipped to Kharkiv. The defect rate in deliveries gradually decreased, although the problem was never fully eliminated before the war ended. By the end of the first half of 1945, the efforts were starting to pay off. The quality of the tanks being produced had improved noticeably, though the machines were still far from ideal. Military inspectors were accepting more products on the first submission, and the number of complaints from field units was gradually declining. However, the war in Europe was already winding down, and the question of sending the T-44 to the front was becoming less and less relevant. On May 9th, Germany surrendered, and the T-44, still plagued by production issues, had never made it to the front. The machine designed specifically to take on Tigers and Panthers never fired a single shot at the enemy. All the efforts of the designers, all the sleepless nights of the factory workers, all the enormous struggle to get production running, None of it had a direct impact on the course of combat. But does that mean the T-44 project was a waste of resources? Many military history enthusiasts still wonder why the Soviet command didn't throw everything into mass-producing the T-44, given that it was so much better protected than the T-34. The answer lies in the cold, hard numbers. And the numbers don't lie. Manufacturing one T-44 required 7,945 man-hours, while building a T-34-85 took just 3,210 man-hours. The difference was nearly 2.5 times, and that changed everything. In a total war of attrition, that kind of math was decisive. Every tank factory was operating at maximum capacity, squeezing every last vehicle out of the available production lines. Switching to a new model would inevitably have meant a sharp drop in the number of combat vehicles reaching the front. Instead of 2.5 T-34s, the Army would get just one T-44, and one of questionable quality given all the problems with getting production up to speed. By 1944, T-34-85 production had been perfected at 3 major tank factories, humming along like a well-oiled machine. Workers knew their tasks by heart, supply chains were locked in, and component suppliers worked in a well-established rhythm. Any disruption to this finely tuned system would have thrown a wrench in the works, immediately affecting the supply of armored vehicles to the fighting army. The Red Army in 1944 was conducting massive offensive operations that chewed through equipment at a staggering rate. Operation Bagration, the liberation of Ukraine and Belarus, the advance to the borders of Eastern Europe, all of this required a constant flow of replacement tanks. Every lost vehicle had to be immediately replaced with a new one, or the offensive would stall. Under these conditions, risking a drop in supply for the sake of switching to a new model would have been pure madness. There was another important factor. Besides building new tanks, the factories were repairing damaged vehicles returning from the front. Repair crews worked around the clock, restoring knocked-out machines and sending them back into battle. Introducing a fundamentally new tank with different components and parts would have thrown the spare parts supply chain into chaos and required retraining all repair personnel. It's interesting to compare this with the German side, which actually suffered from having too many types of armored vehicles. The Wehrmacht was running dozens of different tank and self-propelled gun models at the same time, each requiring its own spare parts, crew training, and mechanic expertise. This created a logistical nightmare and reduced the overall effectiveness of their armored forces. The Soviet command was well aware of this problem and aimed for maximum standardization. There's also the human factor to consider. T-34 crews knew their machines inside and out. They understood the strengths and weaknesses and knew how to get the most out of them. Switching to a new tank would have required retraining time, and in war, time is measured in human lives. An inexperienced crew in a better machine often loses to experienced tankers in something simpler. The leadership made the calculated decision not to rush things. The T-44 was produced in small numbers in Kharkiv, which allowed the Soviets to build up manufacturing experience, identify and fix design flaws, and train personnel for future mass production. The newest tanks went to training units, where they were used to prepare crews without risking these valuable machines in combat. This approach paid off completely. While the factories kept churning out the proven T-34, the designers had the luxury of time to iron out the new machine's issues. Every defect found was analyzed, every weak point was reinforced. The tank gradually shed its teething problems, evolving from a rough prototype into a reliable combat vehicle. This experience would become the invaluable foundation for the next generation of Soviet armored vehicles. The end of the war in Europe brought no relief for the Kharkiv factory team. Quality standards only got tighter, since wartime urgency could no longer be used as an excuse for cutting corners. In the fall of 1945, military inspectors organized large-scale trials of 6 T-44 tanks from the September production run. The results were meant to show how much progress the factory had made on quality over the months of intensive work. The final report was discouraging. A significant number of breakdowns and malfunctions during the trials of the September-built tanks clearly demonstrated that quality was still at a low level. The Commission concluded that the factory had still not managed to eliminate defects that had been identified during the operation of tanks from earlier production runs. The problems that Colonel General Korobkov had reported nearly a year earlier continued to plague production. Engines overheated and failed prematurely. Gearboxes jammed when shifting. The running gear couldn't handle extended cross-country marches. Turret mechanisms malfunctioned, making it difficult to aim the gun at targets. Test crews compiled long lists of complaints after every trip to the proving ground. The dream of a reliable, modern tank remained out of reach. But the engineers and designers didn't give up. Every failure was meticulously documented and analyzed. Specialists searched for the root causes of each malfunction, whether it was a design error, a problem on the production floor, or the use of substandard materials. This painstaking work gradually bore fruit. Tanks from later production runs became increasingly reliable, though the improvement process stretched on for years. Over the course of its production run, the Kharkiv factory built approximately 1,800 T-44 tanks of various modifications. These machines went to tank training schools and active units, where they were used to train crews and practice tactical maneuvers. Some of them served with Soviet forces stationed in Eastern Europe, and they would eventually see their only confirmed combat deployment during the suppression of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. The tank that was designed to counter German heavy armor ended up missing the war it was built for entirely. But the true significance of the T-44 project only became clear later. Alexander Morozov's design bureau used all the accumulated experience to create its next machine. The transverse engine layout, torsion bar suspension, hull design solutions, and proven armor manufacturing techniques became the foundation for the T-54 tank. This new machine absorbed all the best features of its predecessor while shedding its flaws. The T-54 received a more powerful 100mm gun, capable of engaging a wide range of contemporary armored vehicles. Armor protection was boosted even further by optimizing the slope angles on the plates. The engine and transmission were completely reworked, eliminating the chronic issues that had plagued the T-44. The new tank turned out so successful that it became one of the most widely produced tanks in history, largely due to its simplicity and low cost. Production of the T-54 and its variants continued for several decades. These vehicles served in the armies of dozens of countries, saw combat in wars across every continent, and earned a reputation as a reliable, low-maintenance, and effective weapon. Each T-54 owed much of its design lineage to the T-44, a tank that never saw the combat it was designed for due to persistent production problems, but whose engineering solutions proved their worth in the next generation. The story of the T-44 is a powerful reminder that the road from a promising design to a dependable production vehicle can be long and rough. The ambitious ideas of designers crashed against the harsh reality of war-ravaged factories, a shortage of skilled workers, and a lack of necessary equipment. But the engineers and workers at the Kharkiv plant stubbornly pushed through every obstacle, and the lessons learned from the T-44's troubled production ultimately laid the groundwork for the next generation of armored vehicles.